Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
We are back here at the GSMC podcast. I am, of course, your host, Josh Hadley, and this is the GSMC Sci-Fi podcast brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Now, what I want to talk about first here is something that it might anger some people, it might not, but what is the limits of fan service? Because I see this all the time, especially when you're changing something from one medium to another. You especially get what's called fan service, where you add something or you include something that is literally only there for the fans. It's not there for your average moviegoer. Sometimes this can be bad, sometimes this can be good. Nowadays, we would call these Easter eggs. I hate that. I hate that term, Easter eggs. The only time Easter eggs should be coming up is during Easter when the bunny, which gives live birth and does not lay eggs, which I've always thought was weird. Why would you give the creature that does not lay eggs the egg thing in the holiday, as well as the creature that jumps up and down with the thing that breaks easy? But whatever, that's neither here nor there. So when it comes to fan service, what's the point of it? Let's say you're taking a comic book and you're making a movie out of it or a television series out of it. Now, you technically already have a built-in audience, so you know the people who read the comic book, they're going to follow you over to the TV series or the movie or whatever it is. At the same time, you have to include the outside world, because you can't just make this for your comic book fans. No comic book, whether it's Spider-Man or whatever. You cannot make a multi-million-dollar film, a multi-million-dollar an episode television series only for the fans. You can't do that. And that's where fan service can be a double-edged sword. Because first of all, you have to include the fans, because if you exclude them too much, well, then you've lost your built-in fan base. At the same time, if you have too much fan service in, say, this movie or TV series, then you've lost the people who are not there, who have no idea what's going on. Because, see, I started thinking about this, that there are lots of things that do this, but I started thinking about it specifically with the new Dune movie that's coming up. Because now, obviously, Dune is a very dense novel. I don't mean dense as in stupid. I mean dense as in there's a lot to get through. There's a lot of meat to this. There's a lot of background. Words you'll have the whole appendix that you'll need to go read the dictionary definition of, things like that. So you have this angle right here. And then from there, you have this thing here, and then you have this thing there. So what it really comes down to is where do you draw the line? Because with Dune, it's sort of difficult, and that's exactly the problem here. If you've not read Dune, maybe you've seen the David Lynch movie from 1984, or you've seen the early 2000s TV miniseries, or maybe you played one of the games. And now that we got the new Denis Villeneuve movie coming out, the thing about that is it Where do you make the fan service? Because you have people who've never read Dune, never read a page of any of the novels, whether it's the Frank Herbert stuff or the stuff that came later. At the same time, you have people who've maybe only seen David Lynch's Dune, and that's all they know a Kwisatz Haderach is, or something like that. Or what about the people who've only seen the Sci-Fi Channel miniseries? So this new Denis Villeneuve thing has to kind of appease all audiences. There has to be stuff in there that only the people who've read the literature are going to get. There's got to be things in there that only the people who've seen David Lynch's Dune are going to get. There's going to have to be callbacks, things like that. So where does it lie? Or do you pull something like Dragon Ball Evolution? Now, I'm not a Dragon Ball fan. Never seen an episode of the TV show in my life. Never read any of the manga. I know nothing about it other than just pop culture osmosis. But that said, what about Dragon Ball Evolution? That was a big budget, huge studio movie a few years ago. And it pissed off everybody. It had too many things from the cartoon in it for mainstream audiences to get into it. At the same time, it changed so many things. The people from the cartoon absolutely hated it. So who was this made for? That's kind of what fan service comes down to. Who was this made for? Was it made for the fans, or was it made for the non-fans? And that's what you get a lot of times, because it's a very, very tight line you have to toe in that area. Because if you make it too fan servicey, then you're not going to get anywhere mainstream-wise. If you change too much from it, you're going to alienate the entire fan base you were trying to get. It's sort of like when DC did the whole New 52 just disaster, however many years ago that was. They weren't satisfied with the readers that they had. They had a stable readership up to that point at DC Comics. Other than an odd issue here, an odd issue there, their readership had almost plateaued. They weren't losing readers every month, but they weren't gaining readers every month. And to DC, that was unacceptable. So what they did was they decided, we want to get the people who don't read DC Comics. So they started making the comic books for those people. For the people who were not reading comic books. Who were not reading DC. And in doing that, they alienated all the people who did read DC, who were just angered at how bad New 52 was. And you kind of see this going in the wrong direction, especially at Marvel. Not necessarily when Disney bought them, but that's a pretty good point to start with. How you'd see like the X-Men, they had these colorful costumes. Well, but then the movie comes out in 2000, and that's super popular with a mainstream audience who doesn't know the comics. Well, we want them to read the comics, right? So we're going to change the costumes in the comics to look more like the costumes from the TV show or from the movie. So then that way, people who are just in a comic book store, or they still had back then at the drugstore or bookstore or something like that, those people will look, oh, it looks just like the movie. Wolverine's in black leather. Because they're not going to recognize Wolverine if he's in the blue and brown costume or the blue and yellow costume or anything. No. So they changed the main source book to reflect what the mainstream audience was expecting. You saw that again and again. Hey, the Green Goblin's always had that iconic Green Goblin costume with the cloth helmet and everything, or cloth hood and all that. And then the Sam Raimi movie comes out in 2001. What happens? He's all green armor in that movie. Oh, look at that. Shortly thereafter, the Green Goblin goes all green armor in the books. And Marvel's not the only one that did this. Hey, Deathstroke appeared at the end of Justice League. And oh, look at that. He's all armored instead of the normal Kevlar costume he wore. Oh, and then he changes into that for the comic book. Oh, look, Superman has that much darker, more basketball sort of sheen in the movies. Well, now he does in the comics. So fan service is something, it gets in the way when you're making an adaptation. And there are some different definitions of fan service, weirdly enough. Sometimes people call fan service just making something for the fans, and they make that a bad thing. And sometimes it is. Like during the whole bad girl craze of comic books in the early to mid-90s, they had this whole thing about you would see all of the artwork with the woman's big heaving breastises all right there on front on the cover, or the samurai chick in the hot thong would be bending over and her ass would be sticking right out at quote-unquote camera at the front of the panel, and you just rolled your eyes and you're like, oh, this is just fan service for the fanboys. And on paper, that shouldn't be a bad thing. It is in practice, but on paper, that shouldn't be a bad thing. So the question is, should fan service even exist? When you're making, let's just say, a comic book or a novel into a movie, should the fans matter at all, the fans of the source material? Or should you try and make whatever that is into its 100% own thing? Should the movie completely 100% stand on its own, where you don't have to read the comic books, you could have never even known it was a comic book, and you still would have been able to get it? Is that a good example of fan service, or is that a bad example of fan service? Because I kind of also extend fan service into, we're making this for a mainstream audience, but we're just going to include a little thing here, a little thing there, a little thing here, a little thing there, that, oh, the fans will go, oh, I get that. Because, like, I remember when I first saw the movie Predators, the third Predator film, and I remember just thinking to myself, what the hell is going on? I've read a lot of the novels, I've played the video games and all that, and this whole, the black Predators versus the old school Predators, I'm like, what is going on? Oh, you had to go read this specific miniseries to understand the movie. You shouldn't have to buy an extra book, an extra series, a video game, something like that to understand the movie. You've seen that a couple of times where, okay, that plot point made no sense in such and such movie. And then you hear, well, if you played the video game, that part of the story is explained. I shouldn't have to play the video game to enjoy the damn movie. That's my point. And that's the stuff I'm getting sick of. That is also a form of fan service, because you know that the fans will fork out that extra dough for you. That the fans are the ones who will bend over backwards to give you money for whatever you're doing. Because you see this all the time. Like, you know, some Disney Plus show, a Marvel show or a Marvel movie, and you look at, well, it's actually played up in the media. Look at the comics accurate costume of such and such character. Okay, why does the term comics accurate even need to exist? Either that character's costume should be its own thing, or you should just deliberately copy whatever the costume is from the comic. Why do you have to emphasize, and look, it's accurate to the comics? Because that can be a problem too. You're trying to appease two masters, and you can't do that. As much as I get mad when I see an adaptation of something that deviates so far from the source material that it can't even be called an adaptation anymore, as much as that irritates me, you also have to look at the fact that then the movie is not trying to be its own thing. I think an adaptation, it has to change, because I'm just taking comic books here. Comic books and movies are two totally separate mediums. What works in a comic book sometimes will not work in a movie, and vice versa. I remember when I first started writing comic books, because I'd written screenplays and stories and that before, and I was... It's such a different medium, because you can only do so much with so many panels on a page. So I remember, to me, I'm thinking in a movie, in 8 seconds, I can show a character going from complete calm to a complete rage and delivering a line of dialogue with a sweeping camera move. You can't really do that in a comic. You have to write that same scene completely differently, and it might take a dozen panels to get that exact same thing off the ground. That's what you run into when it comes to fan service in adaptations. You can't always appease both masters. So what you need to do is pick one. Either you're going to be making this for the fans, which you're not going to be able to do on a $100 million budget, make it only for the fans, or you're going to be making this for everyone, at which point you are going to inevitably piss off some fans and you're going to get backlash. So fan service is very, very much a double-edged sword. And I don't know why it's such an issue these days. It really kind of bothers me what an issue fan service is, because I both hate to see it and I also get mad when it's not done. So it's a very, very sticky issue. So, all right. On that note, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the post-apocalyptic subgenre, because it's a weird thing, and then we'll look at sequelitis, and we'll take a deep dive into the 1985 Twilight Zone series.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
We're back here at the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast. So, one of the most popular subgenres of science fiction is the post-apocalyptic genre. And there's lots of subgenres within this subgenre. But the question is, what really constitutes a post-apocalyptic genre, or a post-apocalyptic story? And then, why are we so interested in this? Because for one thing, what constitutes post-apocalyptic? Does George Orwell's 1984 count as post-apocalyptic? Because you have to define apocalyptic. In George Orwell's world, the society has sort of collapsed and become a new society. But it's not like you would think in The Road Warrior or something like that. And speaking of that, what about the Mad Max movies? In the Mad Max, the original 70s film, it's not really post-apocalyptic. It's society is breaking down. There's a loss of laws in that, but there is still some form of society. And then when, of course, you get to The Road Warrior, it's what we think of as a post-apocalyptic. And what we think of as a post-apocalyptic really all stems from Harlan Ellison and L.Q. Jones, A Boy and His Dog in 1975. And that's where George Miller is even on record where he got the look and the style of Road Warrior from. So everything we're thinking of goes to that. But what about when a story, when it lays out an apocalyptic vision, but it might not be post-apocalyptic, like War of the Worlds? The original H.G. Wells War of the Worlds, massive parts of the world are devastated that will never return. They will never come back. Now, obviously, we technically win at the end, and the Martian war machines end up faltering, and the Martians end up dying. But they did so much damage. Is the world ever going to be able to come back from that? And that said, what about us back engineering all of the Martian war machine stuff? Could the follow-up to War of the Worlds actually make for a much more science fiction-y, cyberpunk-y sort of future? But why do we love the post-apocalyptic genre? Because it is so popular. And some of the things I want to bring up are right on that line. Because you have something like Escape from New York. It's not really post-apocalyptic. There has been issues. Society is sort of running amok. And then when you get to Escape from LA, you've had some natural cataclysms. So does that count as post-apocalyptic, or does it have to be Road Warrior-y? Or does it have to be The Road? Or does it have to be Battlefield Earth? Okay, I'm not talking about how bad Battlefield Earth is. I'm just using that as an example of that is post-apocalyptic. It's just a kind of a different one. Or, now, this wasn't from the Robert E. Howard novels, obviously, but when Oliver Stone first wrote his screenplay for Conan, it was very much set in our world, but thousands and thousands of years in the future. Ralph Bakshi's Wizards is set millennia after World War III. Does that count as post-apocalyptic, or is that just really a fantasy movie that happens to have Nazi imagery in it from the ye old world? Or what about Thundar the Barbarian? When, 2,000 years after a rogue comet strips the atmosphere off the Earth and splits the moon in half. That's really more fantasy, but it's post-apocalyptic. And to me, the biggest question here is, why do we love post-apocalyptic so much? To me, that is the biggest thing here. I've always been attracted to it. Whenever I would see even something like Planet of the Apes or something playing on late night TV, I always loved something that was after the bomb, after society fell, or even something like Logan's Run, where it's so far in the future after the society we know has fallen that they've made a whole new society. What draws us to the post-apocalyptic subgenre, and then the subgenres within the subgenres? Is it that we like to see how a scenario may play out? Like, if such and such thing really happened, that, well, maybe this is how it would actually happen. Or, like, why do we love a zombie movie so much? Or a zombie show like The Walking Dead? Because The Walking Dead, I mean, it's basically a soap opera of really bad storytelling and horrible writing. But it's also, I think The Walking Dead is that ultimate what if that we all say to ourselves, well, I'm going to survive the post-apocalypse, and I would really love to be unshackled from laws and just be able to go around and shoot zombies, and then I can finally, I Am Legend style, go watch the movie that I want. I can go watch Woodstock, not I Am Legend, but the Omega Man, and, I would be this. Let's face it. In a zombie-type world, most of us, we're the zombies, okay? Most of us are not going to be Rick Grimes. Most of us are not going to be Daryl, okay? Most of us are not going to be Merle. Most of us are going to either be a victim of one of these people, or we're going to be the zombies. Because I guarantee you, every time you see a zombie in, let's just say for argument, The Walking Dead, that person told themselves, hey, if the apocalypse happens, I'm going to be the one coming out on top, wearing bear skins, bedding great women, and blowing people's heads off with shotguns. Oh yeah, I'm going to be a warlord, baby. No, they're a zombie. So, is it sort of a weird, I don't want to call it wish fulfillment. Is it sort of a weird what if, a weird fantasy that we play when it comes to the post-apocalyptic genre, that we can see ourselves as Max Rokostansky instead of that little wormy toady that the Humongous has that gets his fingers cut off by the feral kid's boomerang. that would be that guy. You would end up being Wes's boyfriend before you would be the Humongous. You would end up being somebody's bitch before you would end up being Max Rokosansky. And I do think there is a weird wish fulfillment in that. Or again, wish fulfillment is the wrong word. A weird fantasy element. We're fantasizing about us being a badass, living through the apocalypse, living through a zombie thing, living through some natural cataclysm. We all see ourselves, if the big one finally hits LA and splits Los Angeles off, we're going to be there saving people like The Rock. We're going to be there flying that helicopter and fighting monsters and saving the day. But we're not. None of us are. So that's why I think we're drawn to post-apocalyptic. Because if you think about it, post-apocalyptic genre, in and of itself, is pure negativity. Okay, you might be trying to rebuild society. You might find a girl you finally really love. The girl might find, she's finally free of of her shackles or something like that. But really, it's all about negativity. That all of this bad stuff had to happen for you to get your wish. So I think the psychology of a post-apocalyptic world I think it's the same reason why we watch horror movies. When we watch a horror film, we have this, that whole release. We have that build-up of tension and terror, and then the release when you scream, or when a really well-executed Exorcist 3 style jump scare hits you, and you're like, oh my god, that was fantastic. It wasn't some bad Bagul scare like Blumhouse does. So I think the post-apocalyptic subgenre is so popular because of that it has this fantasy element the same way a superhero does. Because all of us see ourselves, if we were bitten by a radioactive spider, instead of drooling on ourselves, growing hair all over our body, and shooting webs out of our butt, we see ourselves as Spider-Man. And not what would probably logically happen, which would be dying of radiation poisoning, along with maybe a spider bite. So, a brown recluse, that's what I was thinking of. Couldn't think of the damn kind of spider. So, I think the psychology of the post-apocalyptic genre can't be ignored. And I'm also in there. I'm not looking down on any of you listening to this, because I also am attracted to this genre. I can't even count how many novels and VHSs and DVDs and comic books and all this that I have from the post-apocalyptic genre. And we're all kind of drawn. It doesn't matter whether you're Christian. Doesn't matter whether you believe in the apocalypse, in Jesus' return, whatever. It doesn't matter one whit about that. We all both fear and anticipate the apocalypse. Whatever that apocalypse is, and whatever that apocalypse might be, some of us, because right now, look at it like this. We are living in a sort of apocalypse right now. It's not like you'd see in a movie other than maybe Contagion or something. With the whole COVID nonsense, we are sort of living in the opening text crawl of a post-apocalyptic movie, if you think about it. This could go bad. We don't know. Maybe I've just seen way too many movies, but I'm just waiting for this thing to mutate. And masks no longer work and all this. I'm just waiting for this to turn into some human ending plague on Earth. Where we got to start over with day one. Because all of us are sitting here and we're thinking, well, the COVID, that's not going to affect me. That's going to affect those other people. I mean, you see all of these posts online. Oh, this sucks. I wanted zombies. Yeah, did you really, though? Because you and I both know your mom is going to get bitten by a zombie. You're going to get bitten by a zombie. Or the zombies are going to make it where you literally have to live in one room of your house until you starve to death and then become reanimated and become a brainless zombie yourself. And that's not even getting into the whole metaphorical media zombies nonsense. But that's the thing we're dealing with right here. The apocalypse is oddly cathartic. I think there's a weird catharsis to it. It's the same way when you hate an actor, and you just really, really hate an actor, and there's a catharsis with seeing them get killed in a movie. I'm not saying you want to actually have that actor die. Like, I despise Greta Gerwig. I cannot stand this woman or anything she touches. I don't want any harm to actually come to Greta Gerwig. But when you watch a movie like House of the Devil and you see her head get blown off with a shotgun, there's a real catharsis to that. And that's what I think the post-apocalyptic genre does. It brings in the catharsis of, well, maybe if I die in the first wave, at least I know what Earth is going to be like. Because, you know, I used to make a joke on Facebook, if anyone follows me on my Facebook, and that is, I'm going to be really pissed off if zombies actually happen and I die in the first wave before this thing becomes a Quentin Tarantino, George Romero movie. And in all honesty, no, I don't want that. I don't want to see my family die in nasty ways or torn apart. I don't want to see my granddaughter rended limb from limb and eaten by zombies. I don't want to see my mom slowly die of radiation poisoning because we started World War III in the day after. And neither do you. But if you see it in a movie, if all of a sudden DEFCON 4 happens, the movie, not the actual thing, you're completely entertained. There's a weird thing to the post-apocalyptic genre. There's a reason it's endured for so long. I mean, it goes way back from before Boy and His Dog. Boy and His Dog is only what we now would consider the post-apocalyptic genre. Otherwise, it goes to The Day Time Ended. It goes to Panic in Year Zero, all of that stuff. There are so many post-apocalyptic movies that we wouldn't even necessarily call a post-apocalyptic movie any longer. Or at that point, the genre didn't even exist. So why do you like post-apocalyptic movies so much? I think that's the biggest question we have here. Why are you so into this? And it's the same thing with me. As I said, I'm not judging you. I'm not looking down on you any more than you're looking down on me. Because I love this stuff too. So as far as I'm concerned, we can all go up. As long as I get to see what happens next, and it's not some Soylent Green or The Bad Batch where you're just kept alive while a cannibal is slowly hacking your limbs off for dinner while you get to watch it all. It's just, there's that one shot in The Bad Batch when she's escaping, and you see these just people that are just with no arms and no legs just sitting there, knowing that they have literally no reason to live anymore. And it's just, it's nasty. I don't really want that kind of future, but at the same time, I will watch it in a movie. And speaking of watching it in a movie, when we come back from break, we're going to talk about why there are so many sequels and they're rarely any good.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Sequels. We all love sequels. We all hate sequels. We watch movie sequels, television spin-offs, novel sequels, novel series. To have any sort of a franchise, which is something we all love, a sequel kind of has to happen. There are certain authors out there who always hated making sequels, like Harlan Ellison. I brought up A Boy and His Dog in the previous segment. And if you read the original Vic and Blood stories, Ellison was bothered for years and years and years and years and years. We want a sequel. We want to know what happens next. What happens next? And Ellison very famously hated sequels. He just hated them. So when he finally caved in, and he was like, oh, you want a sequel? Fine. I'll give you a sequel. And it was very depressing, and he basically went in the area that the audience did not want him to go to because he was sick of being asked to make a damn sequel. But then there are other places, other franchises that are more than happy to. I remember when I was growing up in the 80s, I was born in the 70s, but I was a teenager, or I was a child technically through all of the 80s, and I remember where it just became inevitable. When you had a hot movie, when you had a movie that did really, really well, whether it was an indie feature or a studio feature, there was a sequel, inevitably. Or at least one that was written. It doesn't matter if it's something like Beetlejuice, where the sequel was only written and never made. There were sequels to Repo Man, and, you name any big, especially genre film from the 80s, there was a sequel in some form of a planning stage. Whether it actually got made or not, that's debatable, and that doesn't make a difference here. But I remember when Friday the 13th came out. Friday the 13th was a one and done. Never planned to make a sequel. It was, this is just a movie. And then it did so well. So it was like, well, we got to make a sequel. We got to crank this thing out now. And then every year it became... It's sort of like the Saw movies. I remember as bad as those got after the third Saw. I remember the trailers always started with, it's Halloween, so that means it's time for Saw. It was just expected. Every Halloween, there'd be a new Saw movie. And while the dates might have changed, it was every single year we knew there was going to be a Friday the 13th movie. We just knew it. And then after Nightmare on Elm Street became a hit in 1984, we knew there was going to be a new Nightmare on Elm Street movie every year or two. And while Halloween was sort of the weirder one, because while Halloween 3 was supposed to be doing that, Halloween 3 did so poorly that they just decided to scrap that until 1988 when Halloween 4 came out. So there was that big 5-year gap between those. But then after that, it was almost every year or two, we're going to make a new Halloween movie. And that's the thing. It's not just with slasher franchises. It was with Star Trek movies, things like that. And everything. Like I said, you look at anything from the 80s that was a franchise. There was a sequel something. Whether the sequel was baked into the original or not, or whether it was some closed-off story. Like, to me, Planet of the Apes was a relatively closed-off story. I thought Beneath the Planet of the Apes was actually a pretty clever way to make a sequel. And then that made the ending of Beneath the Planet of the Apes is pretty damn definitive. There's no getting around, this is the end of this franchise. But they were like, hey, this one made so much money, we gotta make another one. And then, so of course, they tried to get around it with Escape, and then with Battle For, and then blah, blah, blah. And it got ridiculous. Although I do think Battle for the Planet of the Apes, the fourth film, that might be one of the best sequels ever made. That's a fantastic movie, although I do think Beneath is damn good, too. So even when it's written into the film itself, I mean, how do you get another sequel after Beneath the Planet of the Apes when they literally blow Earth up? There's nowhere to go from here. And you kind of see this with the Iron Sky movies. So Iron Sky was pretty good. It was really fun. I really enjoyed Iron Sky quite a bit, actually. Then there was the Iron Sky sequel, and I was like, all right, this is getting ridiculous. This isn't very good. And then I thought, okay, at least it's over now. And then, of course, there's the post-credit scene that's absolutely setting up an Iron Sky 3. And I went, oh, just let it die. You're already on a sliding scale. Iron Sky 2 was bad. It was really bad. You know the third one's not going to be any better. Because that's the thing when it comes to... There used to be this term, I don't think you hear it as much anymore, but it was called sequelitis. This whole land of diminishing returns sort of thing, where, if you're putting out a sequel to a movie every single year, year after year after year, boom, 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 you have less prep time. You usually are a little more sloppy with how you make it. The sequel, with rare exceptions, is going to be worse as a film than the film that preceded it. And in general, it will do worse at the box office to the point where it's always a land of diminishing returns, both artistically and financially. Roger Corman had this thing, and he used the Carnosaur movies as an example. He technically made more than 4, but that's with spin-offs and stuff and films that weren't Carnosaur but were supposed to be. But he made 4 Carnosaur movies. And with those 4 Carnosaur movies, the first one had a $500,000 budget, and it made $700,000. So the second one, well, we're not going to spend as much, so that one's only got a $400,000 budget, but it only made $500,000. And he kept making them until part 4 made what it cost. And it was, okay, that's done. Because he knew they were just going to keep getting lower, and he was going to have to keep lowering the budgets to the point where they would be unstable in the fact that you could not keep making these films at any level of quality. And that proved later with the other movies. But the point is, look at the Friday the 13th franchise. Each movie got a little bit cheaper than the movie before it. And each one made a little bit less money than the one before it. Which is a weird thing when you have something like Friday the 13th, where it was such a pop culture staple that it was amazing that each movie made less money when it was more recognized in pop culture, which is a really, really strange thing that I'll maybe talk about in another episode. Well, it's sort of a pop culture osmosis, if you will. And with that, it makes you wonder, so does something becoming more accepted in pop culture, is that why the box office kept going down? Or was it in spite of the fact that Friday the 13th, the hockey mask, Jason Voorhees, Machete, etc., were so rooted in pop culture? That really makes you wonder. Like, in the next segment, I'm going to be talking about the Twilight Zone, the 1985 Twilight Zone. And you got to wonder, with the Twilight Zone being as iconic as it was, why did the 85 version just do in the ratings? When it should have been, on paper, a complete smash hit. So, when it comes to sequelitis, how do you feel about this? Is it where eventually you just get to a point where, oh my God, how many movies are in this franchise? Like, I bet most people have not even heard of the movie Witchcraft from 1988. And you would probably be shocked if I told you, with all sincerity, there are 16 Witchcraft movies. And I bet you didn't even know that there was one. Or if you remember that one, you are shocked that they kept making these. I mean, hell, 14, 15, and 16 came out 2 years ago. They were still making this franchise into the late 2000s. And from what I understand, they're making another one. So there might be 17 soon. So there are things like, if I ask you right now, without looking it up, how many Universal Soldier movies are there? I bet you don't know. And I bet you don't know because this kind of gets weirdly confusing, because you had Universal Soldier. Then you had two, if you were in America, they were Showtime original movies, and if you were overseas, then they were direct-to-video, but you had Universal Soldier 2 and 3, and then that was it. And then you had another movie that decided, no. I'm going to be Universal Soldier 2, and it's going to ignore all the others. And then the next movie after that was, no, I'm Universal Soldier 2, and that ignores all the others. How many Universal Soldier movies are there? I'm not going to tell you. I want you to tell me. How many Universal Soldier movies are there? Because I bet you didn't know that there was more than one. I bet you all remember the Jean-Claude Van Damme, Dolph Lundgren one with Ali Walker, and I bet you were like, maybe I heard something that they made like a sequel or something. Or how does sequelitis work when it's a remake of a remake of a remake of a remake of a remake and you keep adding numbers to it? Like the Watchers franchise. Does that even count as sequels when literally, and I'm not exaggerating, each Watchers film is an adaptation of Dean Koontz's Watchers. None of the films have any continuity with each other because each film is a reboot of the entire franchise, but each film is labeled Watchers. Watchers 2, Watchers 3, Watchers 4. So you would be forgiven for thinking, well, I'm not going to watch Watchers 4 because I never saw Watchers 3. When in reality, you literally don't need to because they're all the same film with different casts. So does that fall into sequelitis or not? Because there was this thing, especially if you read Fangoria and Starlog in the mid to late 80s, people just got so bogged down with, oh my God, another sequel. Well, of course we've got another Friday the 13th coming out. Oh, of course there's another Texas Chainsaw Massacre coming out. Oh, of course, insert franchise here, there's another one of these coming out. The problem with sequelitis is it's a self-defeating prophecy. The more sequels you make, the more you're going to annoy your audience. And to swing this all back around, the more you're going to need to rely on fan service. Because when you get to the 13th Witchcraft movie, you are not making these movies at all for a mainstream audience. You're not making these movies for people who have not seen every other one of the Witchcraft movies. You are making this movie specifically for the fans of the franchise. So in a way, this all wraps back to fan service. When a franchise goes on too long, fan service is inevitable. Not just inevitable, it's necessary. And that also comes back to especially when a franchise goes on for a long time and you decide to start ignoring the sequels. Like right now we have, and I'll talk about this in coming episodes, Full Moon is making Sorority Babes in the Slimeball Bowl-orama 2. And that's what they're calling it. Sorority Babes in the Slimeball Bowl-orama 2. But there already was a sequel to Sorority Babes in the Slimeball Bowl-orama. 1991's Sorority Babes in the Dance-a-thon of Death. So, is this movie just saying Dance-a-thon of Death doesn't count? Which I bet most of you, even if you had heard the news of this movie or remembered it from when Joe Bob showed it or something, I bet 99.9% of you have never even heard of Sorority Babes in the Dance-a-thon of Death, and now you're going to go look it up and go, oh my God, they actually did make a sequel to this that nobody saw. So with this new one, is that a victim of sequelitis? Or is that just a totally and woefully unnecessary sequel to a franchise that isn't even a franchise because it shouldn't have been a franchise because nobody knew it was a franchise, but it was a franchise. It was just a hidden franchise. So do you see how this can kind of all be like an Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail kind of thing? When it comes to sequelitis, you can get burned out really, really quick, especially if you're doing this on that yearly basis like Friday the 13th did, like Saw did, when every year, like the Purge movies, every year we're getting a new Purge movie. Or The Conjuring, every year we're getting a new one of these, or a new Annabelle, or something like that. Why is sequelitis not only a thing, but why is it a bad thing? That's my question to you. So we're going to take another break, and when we come back from that break, we're going to look at the almost completely overlooked and ignored Twilight Zone 1985.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
We all know the classic Twilight Zone intro theme. And well, the thing is, how many of you know about the 1985 TV series? Because I think the 1985 TV series was, I'm not going to say better than the original Rod Serling series, but I will say I don't know, there's something about me enjoying it a little bit more, maybe because I wasn't alive during the 1950s and 60s series, but I was alive in 1985, and I was not quite a teenager, and I remember watching those first run on Friday nights on CBS. Now, let's go back to the beginning. So the Twilight Zone, created by Rod Serling, ran for 5 seasons on CBS in the late 50s and early 60s. Then it was critically acclaimed. It eventually got canceled. It showed up in syndication, and then that's where it just blew the hell up. Everybody knows Twilight Zone. And what's kind of funny is that whole do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do Twilight Zone thing wasn't even in the first season. That didn't show up till the second season intro. So it's sort of weird when you watch the first season episodes and it doesn't have that, or the on-camera Rod Serling introductions, because he just did voiceovers at that point. So in 1983, Steven Spielberg got together with, Joe Dante and John Landis, the murderer, and George Miller, and they made Twilight Zone, the movie. And despite John Landis killing people for real on that film, it was a pretty decent success. Burgess Meredith now taking over the narration duty. It actually worked quite well. So that, in a way, ushered in a brand new anthology boom on television. You had NBC all of a sudden bringing amazing stories there with Spielberg, and then you had Alfred Hitchcock Presents coming back on NBC as well. ABC had a couple, like The Dark Room a year or two earlier, and CBS, who owns the Twilight Zone, decided after Twilight Zone the movie, now is the time to bring Twilight Zone back. Now, obviously, Rod Serling's dead at this point, but they thought now is the time. They kind of wanted it as a sort of, up yours competitor to Steven Spielberg and NBC on Amazing Stories. They couldn't compete budget-wise, but I think way better storytelling. Way, way better. So what they did is they hired Philip DeGauer to put this together, and what he did was he decided, I'm going to tap into the pure science fiction vein. And he hired Ray Bradbury and Stephen King and Harlan Ellison and just, you name a science fiction writer at that time who was working or willing to work in television. They were brought over to the Twilight Zone. And they gladly were. And Harlan Ellison was even not just a writer on it. He was the creative consultant and sort of a de facto producer on it, even though he technically never got the position of producer. So the thing with this Twilight Zone is it was going to be in color, obviously. Obviously, with Serling dead, you can't... it wouldn't be right to try an on-screen narrator again to replace Rod Serling, which is, one of the ego massages that Jordan Peele's garbage version thinks he can be the next Rod. That's a whole different thing. I'm not going to get into that. So they decided to just do this with the voiceover, and originally they had Charles Adler, I think it was, do the voiceovers for seasons 1 and 2, and there's a reason, even though the show lasted 3 seasons, seasons 1 and 2 are vastly different, but I'll get into that in a moment. So they got off the ground running. They had Wes Craven, fresh off of A Nightmare on Elm Street, directing episodes. They had very, very great ideas. And Joe Dante, who directed episodes of Amazing Stories and directed episodes of The Twilight Zone, said there was such a massive difference between the two shows. The way he put it was that Amazing Stories had all the money in the world and no ideas to make with that money. The Twilight Zone, on the other hand, had so many ideas they were running over with them, but they had no money to actually make them. So if you do watch the old 80s Twilight Zone, some of them look bad. I just mean on a visual level. The effects aren't the best. The costuming might not be the best. The sets might look a little bit weird and wonky. It's kind of weird when you watch these again, just how not good they look. I mean, they try to make up for it with great acting, great lighting, things like that, but it doesn't look visually nearly as good as something like Amazing Stories. So that all said, so you had this giant issue with having no money and just having great ideas. And the thing is, if you remember when I talked about Night Gallery last week, in this, at least for seasons 1 and 2, you had an hour-long time slot. And in that, you'd have stories of all different lengths. You'd maybe have a 7-minute story, a 30-minute story, and a 20-minute story, and then the commercials. Sometimes you'd have one long 50-minute story. It sort of became a crapshoot, and that's one thing that really didn't help the show, was you never quite knew what you were getting when it came to the Twilight Zone week to week. And you also had so many different genres all over the place. You could have a deep, hard science fiction space story, and then you could have an interdimensional story, and then a comedy story, and then a post-apocalyptic cyberpunk story, all in 1 hour. And that didn't go well with fans. Then you had the fact that CBS thought, well, it's going to be for science fiction fans, right? Well, those nerds don't have girlfriends. They don't go out. We'll program the show on Friday nights. As we all know, that did not work out so well for any show programmed on Friday nights. There's what Fox used to call the Friday night death slot. So that the ratings were a problem right from the beginning. And I believe they were getting beat by reruns of Mr. Belvedere. And Philip DeGauer said that cut to the bone. He was so hurt when he saw that. Nobody was watching the 1985 Twilight Zone. Despite that, CBS picked it up for a second season. They, I guess, were committed to this, and you can't blame them for that. So, the second season, there are some damn good episodes in season 2, but not nearly as good as season 1. They lost Harlan Ellison over the Deadly Knackles affair, which I might go into in another episode. Basically, Harlan Ellison very publicly was fired / quit the Twilight Zone to the point where it was covered in Time magazine, on Entertainment Tonight, all of that, over a censorship issue, over a Christmas episode. And you had lost some of the directors. Wes Craven would go on to start making some more movies, so you didn't have him. You didn't have the same caliber of actors, probably because the budgets all went down because season 1 didn't do very well. So season 2 was the same thing, hour-long format. And after that, CBS was kind of done. So a couple of years went by. This was a dead thing. It was a thing that was gone. Twilight Zone 85, it was just a thing that happened. And then in 1989, Somebody got the bright idea. Now the syndication market is blowing up at this point. You got Tales from the Dark Side, Monsters, all of this stuff. The syndication market is just huge. So they decided, well, why don't we bring the Twilight Zone back as a syndicated show, as a first-run syndicated show, and we can run that alongside the classic episodes. Well, the problem is those hour-long episodes with the segments of all the different lengths, this is going to sound like I'm repeating what happened with Night Gallery last week, but it's the same story, were very difficult to cut down. Because again, it's easier to sell a half-hour show than it is an hour-long show. So they wanted the new Twilight Zone, the brand new episodes, to be 30 minutes. But along with that, they wanted to cut up the 2 seasons of the hour-long episodes into multiple 30-minute episodes. Sometimes that meant cutting the guts out of a longer story to the point where it makes no sense, or padding out one of the shorter stories to the point where it makes no sense. And then they had a whole new season with way lower budgets, now all shot in Canada instead of being shot in New York and Los Angeles like the first 2 seasons were. Now it's all shot in Canada. You're getting syndicated actors now. Harlan Ellison would come back to adapt his own Crazy as a Soup Sandwich into the second to last episode. But all the stories are just one story for a half hour now. And because they couldn't get Charles back as the narrator for this one, I don't know if it was lack of money, or I actually think he might have died between this era. They got Robin Ward to start doing the narration for the 1989 episodes. Problem with that is they didn't want the lack of symmetry with the recuts of the 1985 CBS episodes. So they had Robin Ward go back and redo all of the voiceovers for the syndicated versions. And then the Twilight Zone just sort of petered out after that. It had that third season, it wasn't bad. There were some damn good episodes. The Cold Equations was fantastic. If you've never seen or read that story, go in cold, because that one had an ending that I said, there's no way they're doing this on TV. They did it. So the Twilight Zone 1985 just sort of became a footnote. And then you had the 2002 UPN version and the absolutely horrendous and insulting Jordan Peele version. And people talk about the Jordan Peele version now because it's currently on. They talk about Twilight Zone the movie. They talk about the original Twilight Zone. No one really talks about the 1985 version. And I think that's sad because there are so many fantastic episodes. There is just some outrageously fantastic storytelling in the Twilight Zone 1985. And part of the problem is that it's not on any streaming service. Maybe it's on CBS All Access. I'm not 100% sure about that because I don't have that garbage service. But the thing is, quality is an issue. Because one of the things that they did on Twilight Zone 85, again, because the budgets were relatively low, they were shot on 35 millimeter. But this was a new technique at the time, and a lot of shows started doing this, which, bites you in the ass later. While it was shot on 35, they would then transfer that 35 to videotape and then do all the editing and video effects on videotape. So when they made the DVDs of Twilight Zone 85, those are literally, and I'm not using the word wrong, the best quality you're ever going to get. There are no 35 millimeter masters. Maybe you could find the raw footage on 35 in some vault somewhere. But the masters of the episodes, the best you're going to get is 3/4 inch videotape because of a cost-cutting measure. So maybe that's why it's not on a streaming service. You can't get quality high enough. Maybe that's why it's not on Blu-ray, because you can only upscale the DVDs so much. So that's also a problem, is the episodes don't look great even on DVD because of the fact that they were transferred to 3/4 inch videotape. And I think it's unfair that this Twilight Zone is forgotten. It's just always overlooked as, well, it was that failed follow-up to Rod Serling's original masterpiece. It was that failure. And was it a failure? On a technical level, yes, it was. because the ratings didn't do very well. But I think with so many great episodes, like Nightcrawlers, or The Box, or Grandma, or Shatterday, or I could just keep naming off episodes, To See the Invisible Man, anything like that, that it was so good that I think it went over the heads of people in 1985. The episodes, I believe, are literally just as good as the Rod Serling episodes. The only difference is they're in color and Rod's not involved. And that's not even dealing with in the 90s when we had the Rod Serling's Lost Classics thing. That's its own thing. But give Twilight Zone 1985 a chance. Try to find it. I think most of the episodes are on YouTube. Probably not legally, but they are on YouTube for you to watch. Really look for stuff like Dead Run or Shatterday or One Life Furnished in Early Poverty or, good God, Paladin of the Lost Hour or something like that. Go and look these things up. You will not be sorry. So, that said, my voice is starting to give out here. So I want to thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you, of course, by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd also like to ask that you remember to subscribe to the show, write a nice review, because it really helps us out, and also if you want to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of that nonsense. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.